Good evening. It's my great pleasure to be with you. I'm also very thankful to the Mises Institute and also to Prof for making my time with you possible. I've had a wonderful time during this past week that I've been in Poland. I've been treated very well. I've eaten very well. I've eaten probably too well. And it's a wonderful, wonderful day, a wonderful spring day, and it's wonderful to end my visit in this meeting with you. It is my great pleasure to be with you today. The topic of my talk this evening is why Keynesianism failed. And it's an interesting time, especially as an American, to be speaking about Keynesianism and to be speaking about Keynes, and to be arguing that Keynesianism and Keynesian ideas have failed. Because, as I will discuss in my talk, even though as an economic policy, Keynes and his ideas have failed, and failed miserably, and most economists are convinced of this, as a political ideology, Keynesian ideas are unfortunately still living and breathing, and understanding these ideas and talking about these ideas is of critical importance for economic growth, for economic development, and ultimately for personal liberty and freedom. So I'm happy to be speaking with you on this topic tonight. Now, in some ways, I feel like I am preaching to the believers tonight. I'm fairly certain that I don't have to do much convincing tonight, but what I hope to do this evening is affirm ideas that you already understand and make that understanding even deeper and more convincing and more sure. So let me begin by reminding us all the story of John Maynard Keynes. And John Maynard Keynes is a famous British economist, and he lived during the years 1883 to 1946. And he was the main proponent and, of course, the namesake of what we now refer to as Keynesian economics. And Keynes was always influential. He had positions within the British government, but his greatest influence came with the publication of his 1936 book that people casually refer to as the General Theory, but the full title of the book is The General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money. And it's important to understand the setting in which Keynes wrote this book. Keynes wrote this book during the middle of the Great Depression, when not only the American economy, but also the British economy were struggling. It was a period of very long decline in GDP, very high levels of unemployment rates. In fact, at the highest levels in the Great Depression, the unemployment rate in the United States rose as high as 25%, which compared to the 1920s was extremely high. And so even though 25% unemployment is not in the great scope of history time for a panic, at the moment it seemed extremely serious indeed because of how low unemployment rates had been immediately before that. So people were comfortable with low unemployment rates. They'd sort of come to expect low unemployment rates. And when unemployment rates began to rise and rise rapidly, not only in the United States but elsewhere, many people were panicked. Well, what was economics like before Keynes? And I refer to the thinking about economics before Keynes, generally speaking, as classical macroeconomics. And it's a bit of an oversimplification, but I think that sometimes we need simple understanding of basic ideas. And so classical macroeconomics was developed centuries ago when St. Thomas Aquinas was working on economics. He was developing he was developing classical economics. when Catholic scholars in the school of Salamanca were studying economics. They were studying classical economics and developing it. And it first came together largely in the 18th and the 19th centuries. And it included such economists as Adam Smith, David Ricardo, and John Stuart Mill. And you may have noticed that this evening I'm wearing a very special necktie. It is my Adam Smith necktie. If I had a Hayek or a von Mises necktie, I would be wearing it, but all I have is Adam Smith. So I'm wearing my Adam Smith necktie. And in this classical view, the power of markets is incredible. Markets work constantly without any deliberate effort to create value and to create wealth. And even though it's the case that economies will rise and fall in the short term, the long-term path of economic history is clear. In a market, every one of us, when we have freedom of opportunity, when we have freedom of choice, every one of us has a chance to discover how we can be of service to another person. So in this way, markets are fascinating. Markets are amazing. Markets are wonderful because they constantly, without a central plan, without central organization, they direct every one of us into the service of another person. So I like the way that the American economist Walter Williams puts it. He says that in a market economy, whether you care about another person, or even if you do not care, or know personally another person, the only way that you can advance yourself and have a better life in a market economy is to serve someone else. And when you serve another person, give them something that is easier for them to buy than to make for themselves. Give them a better product or service than the one that currently exists. Or give them a product that is just as good as what currently exists, but at a fairer price, at a better price. Then you act in the service of your fellow man. So the idea of Smith's invisible hand is an amazing one. It explains and elaborates on what scholars like Aquinas knew already, that economic markets are part of God's created order. And the reason that scholars like Aquinas wanted to study economics is because they knew that economic laws were just like the other parts of God's creation. And by studying and understanding economics, you could gain insight and understanding into the mind of the Creator himself, just like studying biology or any other sciences. And so it was a powerful thing, the study of classical economics. And so economies will sometimes grow, sometimes fall a little bit, but even when economies falter and the growth rate is slower, even that is exciting, because a market economy constantly remakes itself. It constantly transforms itself. It constantly renews itself. And it renews itself in ways that couldn't possibly be imagined even a generation before. If you went back 250 years ago, and you found a person who lived 250 years ago, and you put that person inside a time machine, and that person from 250 years ago could travel through time, and you brought that person to the year 2012, and you let that person spend the day with a very rich guy. Suggestions? Who is a very rich guy?
Bill Gates.
Bill Gates is a very rich guy. If you put a person in a time machine from 250 years ago and let that person spend a day with Bill Gates, I don't think that the thing that would amaze the person who lived 250 years ago, I don't think the thing that would be amazing to that person is that Bill Gates has a very big house, or that Bill Gates has many people working for him. I think that the thing that would be amazing to someone from 250 years ago is mobile. I think that is what would be impressive. And does Bill Gates have mobile? Of course. But do most of us have mobile? Yeah, also of course. Now, 250 years ago, even 30 years ago, I don't think anyone would have imagined that I would have a quad band GSM, and I would travel from the United States to Warsaw and Krakow, and I would be able to pick it up with no wire. It's like a magician, no wires, and be able to make telephone calls to my lovely wife back in the United States at a reasonable price. But I'm able to do these things. Why? Because market forces and the power of entrepreneurship, they constantly direct us to think of something new, something that maybe you and I couldn't think of, but someone else can if they're very creative. So simple things that Bill Gates has, simple things like refrigeration, central heating and air conditioning, clean drinking water. Those are the things that I think if you took someone from 250 years ago and let them spend a full day with one of the richest guys we know, would be really amazing, are the things that not only Bill Gates has, but that most people have, even many poor people around the globe. So government intervention, even when it has the very best intentions, according to classical economics, it cannot improve, and it cannot improve in the short term, and especially in the long term, in the ways that we create wealth and new products and new technologies, and we make them less and less expensive, so that even an average guy can have access to mobile, refrigeration, clean drinking water, and those things. Well, during the Great Depression, of course, and compared to recent history, things looked very bad. The Great Depression was a period that stretched on for 1 decade, from roughly 1929 to 1939, beginning with the crash of the stock market in October of 1929. And these were very difficult years. I can tell you a story about my own family. My father was born in 1927. And my father had 2 older brothers. Their father had vanished. Their father was a very bad man, and he had run away. And my father's mother, she had only attended 4 years of public school. Only 4 years. And by the early 1930s, this woman who had only been to 4 years of school, with no husband anymore, she had these 3 children, these 3 boys, and my father was the youngest. And she had to care for them and make way for them. And it was a struggle. It was a very serious struggle in the Great Depression, in a very poor part of the United States. It's the region known as Appalachia. Very poor part of the United States. And she was trying to raise these 3 children with only 4 years of education at the very beginning of the Great Depression. So what did she do? She worked very hard. She sent my father to live with some relatives, some other members of our family, and it was a struggle for my grandmother and my father and my uncles to make their way during this very difficult period, because life, compared to just 10 years before, was extremely difficult. And how difficult was it? by 1933, the U.S. economy was lying in the gutter. We had built tremendous productive capacity during the 1920s. It was a very exciting time. We invested in factories, we invested in technology, employment was very high. But by the early 1930s, by 1933, the American economy was only operating at about 70% of its capacity. So it had built tremendous capacity in the 1920s, but by the 1930s, only operating at about 70% of that capacity. And so with operating at only 70% of capacity, then cutting people's hours, cutting people's jobs, telling them they didn't need to come into work anymore, it was obvious. It was inevitable. So in that same year, that's when the unemployment rate rose to 25%. And it's important to understand that at that time, there were very few women who were participating in the workforce at that time. So almost 100% of women were not working. I mean, they were working very hard at home, but they were not working, earning an income in the larger economy. Most women. Some were, but most were not. And only about 75% of the men were working. So if you looked at the broader population, the number of adults working was probably only about 5/8 of the economy. Only about 5/8 of the people of working age were actually working. So here's a short time series graph that shows what happened to GDP, gross domestic product, in the United States during the period 1920 through 1940. And on the vertical axis is GDP, and it's adjusted for inflation. So the value of a dollar is held constant in this diagram. And across the horizontal axis, you can see the years from 1920 to 1940. And you can see that the years of 1920 were very good years. Employment was rising, wealth was rising, the economy was growing, productivity was rising, and then the Great Depression happened, and you can see the very sharp downturn in GDP. So you can see that even though the long-term trend was always upward, there was a very difficult 10-year period in not only the American economy, but also other countries across the globe, especially Western developed nations. So in that moment, the perception was that, markets have failed. The stock market, people made too many investments, they bought too many stocks with too much credit, and they had too much hope that the market would only go up, up, up. And so people began to have doubts, and especially since things had been so good, and especially in people's recent memories, then people began to ask, is there nothing we can do? Do we just have to wait and be miserable? Do women like my grandmother have to just wait and suffer through difficult times until maybe someday the economy begins to grow again? So state ownership, state planning by economists, even very intelligent economists, began to look increasingly attractive because it looked like we had had a catastrophe. We had had a traffic accident in the economy. And then it required very smart men who had studied economic ideas very carefully to manage the economy so that something like the Great Depression could end and so that a second Great Depression could never happen again. Now, of course, classical macroeconomics suggested that even a Great Depression will end, but we have to be patient. And even though it's painful, and even though families like my own father's family suffered during these times, classical macroeconomics said, it's okay. we have hope. And the hope is that once the Great Depression has ended, then what life will look like after the Great Depression will be even better, even richer than the good times during the 1920s. And the difficult thing is, it's impossible to know the future. Again, even 50 years ago, the idea of a wireless telephone that's inexpensive, 50 years ago, I think people would think it was a story we were telling each other, a fiction about the future. But here it is today. And so in that period, the idea that an economy could correct itself and all that is required is for prices to send signals, high prices to tell us what to do more of, low prices to tell us what to quit doing. At the time, we were looking for a remedy, and a quick remedy. Keynes changed the focus of economics. And Keynes said we shouldn't focus on the long-term hope and growth and prosperity that market forces create and that a freely functioning price system creates. Instead, Keynes focused on the instability of markets. And he stressed the need for us to occasionally intervene. So for Keynes, economics was more like medical diagnosis. That we could have some very wise economic physicians who would look at the medical chart, look at GDP and unemployment and prices and money growth, and assess the condition of the economic patient and prescribe a remedy, prescribe a therapy, prescribe a way to take a sick patient and make the sick patient feel better. But what Keynes misunderstood is that sometimes a better life requires temporary discomfort. And you and I know this. We know that when we invest in a new business, we have to live very simply in the short term. And when we send our children to school, we have to economize. And we have to be careful with our planning and our resources. Is our life bad? Well, maybe it's very simple and over a short amount of time. But we do these things because we know the good things that such activities can accomplish over the longer term. And so Keynes misunderstood that when an economy looks bad, sometimes that's good. And sometimes it's good because it's a signal that the economy needs to remake itself. It needs to transform itself into something new. And the hard thing to see is because there is no crystal ball, we can't know exactly what the future will look like. Only through discovery, only through entrepreneurship, only through innovation can we discover the most valuable ways to serve each other in a market economy. So Keynes didn't understand that a market is let me use this word, a market is organic. A market isn't something that you can plan and manage and organize and direct using human understanding. A market is self-organizing. It's organic. And it doesn't need a planner to organize that garden. The garden creates itself, and it creates beauty and wonder without a central plan. But Keynes focused on the short-term problem. And he said, oh, we understand economics, we have very good intentions, we're very intelligent. And so we should be able to focus not only in the long term, but even in the short term on full employment of resources, including capital, including human beings, and also on sustained growth. And the intuition was very simple. For Keynes, when there is recession and when people are not working, there's an obvious explanation. And the obvious explanation is that people in the private sector are not spending enough money. If firms grow pessimistic about the future and they don't purchase capital goods from other firms, then those firms have less business, and with fewer orders, less business, they have to cut hours, or they have to let their workers go. And the other problem that Keynes said, the reason that we fall into recession or depression, is that there's insufficient private spending by consumers. And that when we grow nervous, when we are concerned and we save too much money for tomorrow, then that also reduces the orders by firms for more products, more goods. And so for Keynes, the obvious cause of a lack of work was a lack of spending, and a lack of spending in the private sector, by firms and also by consumers. So Keynes proposed a simple remedy. If the reason that people are not working is because private firms and private consumers are not spending money, then the obvious role of government is to begin spending money. Government should begin spending the money on goods and services that private firms and private consumers are not spending money on. So for Keynes, the appropriate role of government is to intervene and to begin spending in the place of private firms and private consumers. And the most interesting feature of Keynes is Keynes gave governments permission to borrow money to finance that spending. Up until this period, especially in American history, the idea that government would issue bonds and borrow lots and lots of money to finance spending was not widely accepted. And Keynes said that not only did government need to buy more goods, it was okay if the money to finance the purchase of those goods had to come from borrowing. Even if you didn't have the money today, it was okay for a government to borrow the money to finance that spending today, because once an economy had recovered, then you would have extra tax revenues and you could retire the debt that you had issued during the recession or the depression. So according to Keynes, government borrowing would be paid back, and it would be paid back in a short amount of time. And to put the best possible face on it, perhaps Keynes was very compassionate, and he saw people suffering in the British economy, and he wanted to help them in the short term. The problem is, Keynes' prescription, Keynes' medicine, the remedy of Keynes, was only a temporary solution that made people feel a little better in the moment, but it was bad medicine, a bad remedy for long-term growth and the creation of wealth. Now, Keynes knew and admitted in his lifetime that his ideas had serious limitations. And Keynes' critics pointed this out. If you borrow and borrow to finance government spending, and in addition, if you use the central bank to increase the money supply, to lower interest rates and make credit cheaper, then Keynes' critics said, wait a minute, we do understand economics, and we know that this additional government spending, we know that the expansion of the money supply, we know that these things will encourage private spending, and they'll encourage too much spending. Spending that isn't real. Prices won't send signals anymore about what to do more of and what to do less of. The price system will send the wrong signals. It will send incorrect signals, and so people won't know how to serve each other anymore. These government interventions will frustrate price signals, and it will be difficult to create wealth and create value, and you'll create inflation. And because you don't know how to serve each other, because you intervene, you get in the way of the price system, it will ultimately slow down the accumulation of wealth, the creation of value. Adam Smith, of course, knew this, And Keynes' critics knew this, and Keynes himself knew this. But for Keynes, his focus was on the short term and not on the long term. And he confessed as much a few years earlier in his tract on monetary reform, when in 1923 he said, yes, government spending, using the central bank to increase the money supply, it will create long-term problems, but if people are suffering today, the appropriate role of government is to help reduce that suffering today. And should we care about the long term? Not so much, because according to Keynes, in the long run, we are all dead. There's no reason to be concerned about tomorrow, because what we need to do is take care of each other today, and we can let our children, we can let the next generations worry about how to take care of themselves tomorrow. Well, Keynes' ideas caught on during the 1930s because of the Great Depression, and the 1940s, and the 1950s, and the 1960s. And the major Keynesian figures in the United States included famous economists like John Kenneth Galbraith at Harvard University, and a gentleman named James Tobin at Yale University. And they were great exponents of Keynesian ideas. And they believed that an economy could be managed. They didn't understand that an economy was organic and that it wasn't something that you could manage. They thought that you could create a system of mathematical equations and you could manage extremely precisely individuals and their behavior, even in a very large economy with millions of people. Keynes and his students believed that it was possible. We were smart enough, we had the right intentions, and we understood economics well enough to manage it, fine-tune it. Just like you can understand physical laws, Keynes and his students thought that you could understand economic laws and manage individual people, people that you don't even know, people that you've never met, people who have hopes and dreams and desires and longings. Keynes and his students thought it was possible to manage those people and manage them in predictable ways. And so Keynesian ideas were so popular by the 1950s and the 1960s that it led to a famous misquoting of Nobel Prize winner Milton Friedman. Now, for those, I'm sure most of us in the room know that Milton Friedman was a great advocate of the price system, of liberty, and of the free market. Yet, Professor Friedman is often misquoted because of a quote that appeared in Time magazine in the United States. And Milton Friedman was quoted as saying, "We are all Keynesians now." Now, let me be clear. Milton Friedman was no Keynesian. When Milton Friedman uttered these words, what he was saying is that, at least at that moment, Keynesian ideas were extremely popular in many universities. And so if you were a student of economics in the 1950s or the 1960s, especially at universities like Harvard or Yale, the brand of economics that was being taught was Keynesian economics, which Friedman thought was wrong, incorrect. But he was trying to make very clear that most economists, especially at famous universities like Harvard and Yale, not Chicago, but Harvard and Yale, most of the economists were Keynesian economists. So these ideas were very popular in the 1960s. But Keynesianism has failed. Keynesian policy recommendations have been proven again and again to be bad policy advice. And further, Keynesianism, Keynes' ideas, they can't even explain economic history. You can't use Keynesian economics to explain what has happened in the past. So, why is it? Why has Keynesianism both failed as a policy prescription and also failed as an economic theory. Let's look at both. First of all, Keynesian economics is terrible economic policy. And it's bad economic policy because of a reason called crowding out. And the idea of crowding out is simply this, that if a government decides that in a recession or in a depression, the answer is for the government to spend more money and to borrow money if necessary, sometimes lots of money. The American economy right now is borrowing billions of dollars, much of it from the Chinese. We're borrowing billions of dollars in order to finance stimulus. But the problem with that advice is that at some point, all of that borrowing will create higher interest rates. And when it creates higher interest rates, and this happened very, very terribly in the 1970s and 1980s in the US economy, when those interest rates are driven very high, it discourages private investment. And so if government is borrowing, and trying to attract financial capital, saving, then it drives interest rates higher and higher and higher, and it discourages investment in new projects by private firms who are interested in building new factories, discovering new technologies, creating new jobs that ultimately lead to long-term economic growth. So this crowding out, that government borrowing discourages private borrowing, leads only to slower long-term growth. Why? Because it slows the rate of discovery of new technology, and it slows down the rate of capital accumulation. We don't accumulate as much physical capital, as much productivity per hour, as we would if Keynesian economics didn't happen. The other consequence is that when government spends your money, and ultimately it is your money, when government uses taxes to do government spending, or government borrows money today to finance projects, government spends money on the things that government wants. And the problem for government is it doesn't know you. Government doesn't know me. In a market system with prices, who knows best what I want? Who knows best what my hopes are, what my dreams are for my life and my family and my children and their children? Nobody knows better than me what I want. A government that's far away, that's trying to manage millions of people, it can't possibly do better than I can at deciding the goods and services that I want. So it's a miraculous thing that in an economy with no central design, no central plan, when each of us, we get up in the morning, and how do we spend our day? We spend our day trying to make our life better than the day before. And we try to make the lives of our children better than they were in our lifetime. But when government spends money, and in my own country we're doing this right now, we are spending hundreds of billions of dollars on stimulus. Government planners in Washington, they don't have the information about all 320 million Americans to be able to make good decisions. The people who know best how to make good decisions are each of the 320 million Americans. In fact, let me ask this question. Please don't raise hands. It's okay, don't raise hands. But my question is this: can you think of a time in your life when you received a gift? Maybe it was for a holiday, maybe it was for a birthday, for a special occasion, and you received a gift. And when you opened the gift, it wasn't perfect. And you were very polite and very gracious, and you thanked the person very much, and you said that you loved it, and it was a wonderful present. But inside you were thinking, I appreciate this person, and I appreciate that they tried to show me some kindness, but they don't know me as well as they think they do, If you've had this experience, then how is it possible that a government can give you what you want when even the very person who loves you the most and knows you better than anyone else sometimes gives you a gift out of love, deep, devoted love and care, gives you a gift that isn't the perfect gift? If the person who loves you the most and knows you best can't get it exactly right, then what hope is there that an anonymous government planner, a central planner, can possibly give you the goods and services that you need to have a better life for yourself and your family? So this phenomenon is something that the Austrian economists refer to as malinvestment, that government spending on goods and services and investment in technology is the wrong investment. It temporarily creates jobs, but 20 years from now, 30 years from now, 50 years from now, we've invested in the wrong things. Because you cannot know 20 years from now, 30 years from now, 50 years from now, what life will be like. You can't imagine the goods and services that people will want and what they will need in order to have a better life. And finally, even if you understand things well and your intentions are good, it's difficult for government to take action at precisely the right moment to have the intended effect. Many economists in the United States who are Keynesians, even today, like the famous Nobel Prize winner Paul Krugman, he thinks that the problem with the American economy is that we haven't done enough Keynesian economics. He thinks that the reason that the recovery has been slow is because government needs to spend $1 billion more. That 787 billion wasn't enough. We need to spend billions more, maybe another trillion. And what Krugman doesn't understand is that, again, an economy is organic. And if you get out of the way, if you let the people get on with their work, then it leads to the creation of wealth, as Adam Smith understood very well hundreds of years ago. Finally, Keynes thought that we could manage an economy like a scientific system, and Keynes was wrong. For example, in Keynes' view, he thought that there was a trade-off between unemployment and inflation, and that you could create lower unemployment today, even if it meant higher inflation rates today. So you should be able to find in the data a trade-off between inflation and unemployment. And this possible relationship was discovered decades before by a New Zealand economist named Phillips. And he looked at 100 years of British economic data, and he found exactly what Keynes described. He discovered that there always seemed to be a trade-off between two bad things, inflation and unemployment. And Keynes argued that we should take advantage of this relationship. And if unemployment rates are very high, then we should be willing to have higher inflation today if it means that we can get people working today. So Keynes said we should take advantage of this trade-off that Phillips discovered. But Phillips was wrong. It's not possible over the long term to take advantage of an inflation-unemployment trade-off. And this diagram is from my book, not this book, but from an earlier book, Economics in Christian Perspective. And the data that you see in the diagram are, each data point represents 1 year in United States economic history. And it represents the combination in that year of the inflation rate and the unemployment rate. And so, for example, one point that's easy to spot is the year 1980. The year 1980 was a very, very bad year in American economic history. Why? Because the inflation rate was very high, and at the same time, the unemployment rate was also relatively high. Again, is an unemployment rate like this terrible? in the United States today, we would actually like to have an unemployment rate that's like this. We would think that it's low. But at the time, this seemed very bad. Well, when you look at all these years together that we have in the diagram, we have 1970, right here, all the way through the year 2000, here. There's no trade-off. There's no trade-off. It's just a cloud. It's just a collection of dots. And in fact, if you use econometrics to try to identify a relationship, it's not the inverse relationship. It's not a negative relationship that Keynes and Phillips thought was possible. If anything, it's a slightly positive relationship. So Keynes was wrong. Phillips was wrong. There is no trade-off that you can exploit between inflation rates and unemployment rates. So what had Keynes missed? What had Phillips missed? And simply put, you and I are smart. We're intelligent. And we know, and when we know what government is going to do as a matter of spending or monetary policy, we change our behavior in anticipation. We're clever, and we know that government is going to make a change. We make changes accordingly also. So, for example, if you and I know that government is going to take a policy action to create a lot of inflation, a lot of price inflation, they grow the money supply, they increase government spending. If we know that inflation is coming, then immediately unions and workers will begin demanding higher money wages. If you know that higher prices are coming, you'll begin asking today for higher wages. And as long as people always anticipate and know exactly what government is going to do with the monetary policy or with fiscal policy, people will always change their behavior in response. And this idea is a powerful idea from the University of Chicago School of Economics called the Policy Ineffectiveness Proposition. And it's very simple. It says, when people know what you are up to, they will change their behavior accordingly, and your policy will have no power. Your policy change will have no power. So Keynesians believed they could stimulate demand for goods and services, and that with this increase in demand, whether it's through government spending or through increasing the money supply rapidly, they could hire more and more workers, and they assumed a constant wage. But you and I know better. If people know that inflation is coming, they begin demanding higher wages today. And so, is the policy effective? No, absolutely not. The policy change is powerless when we expect what government will do. Well, why did Keynes's ideas catch on? If they're so bad, I've spent about an hour telling you why Keynes's ideas didn't catch on, then why did they catch on in the 1930s and 40s and 50s and 60s, and why are they making a comeback today? First of all, the Great Depression was very bad. Second, Keynesian economic ideas make politicians look very good, especially in the very short term. When an economy is bad, it's not a satisfying answer for a politician to say, I'm going to do nothing. I know unemployment is high, I know economic growth is slow, but classical economics, Austrian economics tells me it's okay. This is just a growing pain. Things will get better later. No, no, no. Politicians need to be active. Politicians need to be doing something to look like they are caring for the people. So Keynesian ideas remain popular even today because politicians need to look busy, like they're doing something to try to help a struggling economy. A third reason Keynes' ideas caught on is that another Nobel Prize winner, Sir John Hicks, was the primary translator, interpreter of Keynes' ideas for the rest of the public. Keynes' General Theory was a very difficult book. It was very difficult to read, and it was Sir John Hicks who translated, interpreted the general theory for most economists. And late in his life, Sir John Hicks became convinced that Keynes was wrong, and also that even Hicks had misunderstood the general theory the first time he read it and tried to explain it to other economists and to the public. A fourth reason Keynesian ideas were popular is that it made economics look like physics. It made economics look like engineering, and that you could master in a sophisticated way an economy. And that was very attractive, the idea that you could make economics scientific and use mathematics to manage an economy. Fifth reason is that it wasn't until the beginning of the 1940s that early monetarists, people like Milton Friedman eventually, an economist before him named, American economist named Clark Warburton, realized that the central bank was part of the problem during the Great Depression. And it wasn't until the 1940s that monetarist economists began to appreciate that monetary policy was an active factor in the Great Depression, and the central bank got it wrong in that period. And finally, Keynes' peers who knew better, they were either too easily persuaded or they weren't firm enough in their objections to these Keynesian ideas. So where do we stand today in 2012 with Keynesian ideas? In the 1970s, we got into serious trouble. Europe, the United States, we got into trouble pursuing these policies. They created hyperinflations. Latin America in particular had severe hyperinflations pursuing these Keynesian ideas. So what are we doing today? Have we learned our lesson? Well, my conclusion is very short. And my conclusion is, has Keynesianism failed as a policy prescription and as a description of an economy? And the answer is absolutely yes. But are Keynesian ideas still alive and well with politicians, economists, and with political parties? Also absolutely. And so we need to be more forceful, more clear, and more direct in our communication of the value of liberty and the price system and markets, because these free market ideas, these Austrian and classical ideas, they're true ideas. And even though politicians like to get control and try to manage an economy, in the long run, it is the road to ruin. It is the road to destruction. And so we need to communicate these ideas. And on that note, I will conclude, and I will be happy to entertain any questions. Thank you very much.